Welcome to another collective conversation. I am your host, Mike Brewer, and today we are talking all things critical thinking with Jessica Fern-Kirkland. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent. I like that. That's a good opening. And you're in one of my favorite cities or areas of the country. So can you just tell our listeners and our audience where you're located today?
Oh, I am in the great Pacific Northwest.
I love that place.
Not Seattle Pacific Northwest. I'm like close to Mount Rainier, can see it from my backyard, Pacific Northwest.
I'm jelly, as they say, jealous.
Yeah, we are. Gosh, we had a late start to our summer and it's still going. Tomorrow's supposed to be 92 degrees and today it's about 85 out and I'm just loving it. I love it.
Oh, it is such there is something about nature and being out in nature that I think is just therapeutic to one's soul. So even if you don't live in and around an area like you, people need to go there and get that kind of forest washing, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. Be one with nature. I start to get like antsy if I don't get outside. I'm a huge mountain biker and I'm really lucky that I live close to a trail system. So I'm out a couple times a week or, at the mountains or hiking or spending time outside. I'm a traditional Pacific Northwest junkie.
I love it. I love it. And for those of you who are interested, follow her on Instagram because she has some wonderful posts. It's fantastic. It'll make you jealous. It'll make you want to go to Seattle.
Please come visit.
Definitely. Well, Jessica, you have authored a couple of presentations that I have become deeply interested in, and I really appreciate you sharing them. I know you did the presentations at some various organizations or for some various organizations. I've not seen these things in person, so I've only keyed off of the content directly by reading it. But it's deeply fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me, the timing of it also. I think it's something that is long overdue for the industry and long overdue for, frankly, business in general. The topic today is critical thinking. There are other presentations that you wrote that I think we could segue to in future episodes, but kind of talk to us about why this is a passion for you. Maybe the genesis moment, the eureka moment of why you thought this was important content to bring to the world, and maybe unpack this critical thinking or set the framework for us, if you will, for this critical thinking presentation.
Sure. So, gosh, the name and the concept and the topic of critical thinking made so much sense to me when I started going back to school, actually. I started getting my Bachelor's of Science in Psychology last July, and I'm almost done. I don't know how I've done like 3 years of college in 12 months, but I'm just a crazy person. And that's actually where I learned about the topic of critical thinking, but it's always made so much sense to me, the power that you have to manage your own mindset. I'm a firm believer in that there is power in what you give power to. And I actually, as I look back, even on my speaking career, I've been in multifamily for 14 years. And gosh, I think it was 6 years ago, I had my first opportunity to speak at NAA. And my topic was about successful failure. And that was kind of the first time I dove into this topic unknowingly. And talking about managing our own perception and our definitions. And I started thinking about all sorts of crazy stuff like my fear of spiders, is completely made up. And I am so terrified that they're going to like attack me in my sleep. And I make up all these stories about spiders and freak out. And it has nothing to do with the spider. It has everything to do with me. And I started to learn these skills about not talking, at myself, but really talking to myself, coming out of my marriage, which was super toxic with a narcissist. And those people who have, who identify with that, there are a lot of things that are said to you where you really start to kind of beat yourself up a little bit, or you start to believe it. And it was really kind of then where I started to dive into managing my mindset, and then just decided that I'm the one that gets to say what words mean. And I'm the one that holds, the gate to what I allow in. And I'm the one that gets to manage my response to the world that's happening around me. And that internally started to create my own framework around critical thinking. Then, when this was introduced in school, when I started to get my degree, it made so much sense, the different elements that really go into critical thinking. But I think the element of critical thinking that really sets the tone for what this whole thing is all about is a category or a characteristic of not thinking critically, which is one of my most favorite things to say because it's so invasive, is activated ignorance. And activated ignorance is a characteristic of not thinking critically. And when you think about actively being ignorant, number one, you want nothing to do with any of that. But it's basically activated ignorance is irresponsibility with knowledge and information. It is the active ignoring of everything that you know better and basically letting your emotions run wild. And as I step back and take a look at, my own life and my professional life and things I've witnessed and observed for, the last few years, there's a lot of activated ignorance. And, everyone needs a little dose of critical thinking every now and then. But there's so much that goes into it. Critical thinking really involves being responsible with information, checking your sources, which is, another element. Where are you getting your information from? Uh,
Right.
People make problems. Problems don't just exist. They're only problems because other people make them problems. So how
That's right.
urgent they are is dependent on the person. And I love to tell people that no, no great idea or project or super urgent anything ever came from an email. It just doesn't happen. You
Yeah, that's right.
know? And when we start to have like that sky is falling moment, like that chicken little, oh my gosh moment, when we're allowing this stress to come in, it's because we've got a lack of critical thinking, right? We're not slowing down and identifying what's really going on here. And that is the genesis of this session, is figuring out what the main pitfalls of not thinking critically are. I like to consider myself an expert in what not to do because I failed lots of times. And we've all been guilty of these things. It's hard to be perfect, but it's so useful when we remember, that these specific elements are really partners in our ability to manage our own stress, which is directly related to our own mental health and wellness, and be able to support those around us with solid information and move from reaction to response.
That's I like the way you in cap there. It's really, if I were to sort of boil this down to one word, it's recapturing your agency, right? It's getting your agency back and not allowing your emotions to hijack your reason or your logic in order to show up and respond to whatever the catalyst is, but to do it in a way that is helpful and healthy for you and the person that you might be interacting and engaging with. Is that a fair summation there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another really important element outside of just, thinking about where information comes from is understanding other people, right? And this
Mhm,
is one of the
mhm.
things that I talk about so much because when we talk about conflict and triggers and things that make us mad, there is so much about another person that has nothing to do with us. And part of critical thinking is understanding that I have a worldview And my worldview is encompassed of an environment and situation and circumstance that is very specific to myself. It's based on the neighborhood I grew up in, my parents, the different activities and groups I was involved in, the psychological support and emotional support, and the socio-emotional experiences that I was or was not able to have. So the things that made me mad as a kid, or ways I've been hurt, or things that I love are completely different than yours. So well, I don't know about you, but I've never been like sitting around a table, right? And having a conversation about values, or I'm just going to use politics as an example because it's like the most pervasive and explosive thing that people like to talk about. Like I remember when the COVID vaccine was first coming out, and there was people who had
Mhm.
very strong opinions either way. And I've never sat around a table and shared my opinion about the COVID vaccine and had someone else be like, "Oh my gosh, you just changed my entire worldview." Like in
Right.
this one conversation, I'm a changed person. But we almost get offended when someone doesn't agree. And we consider that like, oh, you're not going to agree? Well, that must mean you're not a good person. And we're making all these assumptions. And it's another element where critical thinking comes in, is remembering that different worldviews exist, different cultures exist, and I'm not responsible for your triggers.
That that's right. That's right. And you use a very poignant example there where it was frankly one of the most polarizing topics in at least the last 2 years, the vaccine thing. And it is interesting. And I hope that we sort of dig down deeper and sort of the underlying catalyst for these responses, the way that people respond, whether what the side doesn't matter, right? It's what is underlying all of that that causes you to show up in that way. Um, what do you think is? I know everything related to your worldview or my worldview and what has happened to us up to this point in time when we're having this clash of opinion. If you sort of peel back all the layers of those onions, and I know there'd be a lot of onions and a lot of layers, what do you think, if you get right down to it, what are those things that are sort of causing division when it comes to the topic of critical thinking?
Yeah. So, in addition to a worldview, we all have this process, and I didn't make this up, so it's very Googleable, but it's a visual called the Ladder of Inference. And it is how we have taught ourselves to work through problems. Our brains are super lazy, and we don't want to do any extra thinking or feeling or emotional management. Our whole body's goal is to maintain a state of homeostasis, which is that neutral
Mm.
point. So when I get upset, my body is going to release certain, hormones and chemicals to bring me back down to a specific state. And so we have these implicit reactions to stimulus. And those reactions to stimulus, once they become habit, or once our brains and bodies learn how to respond to things, it takes an active cognitive effort to actually undo that. So the ladder of inference basically is a workflow of our response to stimulus, where we have seen a certain amount of things happen, where we get data, and then we observe what happens with that data around us. So how are the people around me thinking and feeling and responding? And that's part of what creates our worldview. But then we
Mhm.
start to draw assumptions and conclusions about that data. And a lot of it happens very implicitly, and it causes feelings and it causes emotions. And for things that are very scary or violate our values, we might respond negatively. There is adaptive responses that are very healthy, like breathing or exercise or de-stressing. And then there are maladaptive processes that are like your fight or flight response. So
Mhm.
anytime we feel that something of value of ours is under attack or threatened, and we're not managing that implicit response, so we're not slowing down, we're just going to react. And so,
Mhm.
what our body's going to do is get stressed, and we're going to release cortisol and adrenaline, and it's going to allow us to combat stress a little bit. But if we don't break the stress cycle and we're not managing that, you can actually end up with chronic stress, which makes us even more susceptible to triggers. It's harder for us to slow down, and you can actually end up with what's called general adaptation syndrome, which is a chronic state of stress that can really cause some horrible health conditions. So we almost get paralyzed from being able to self-regulate. But what the key is fear, and it is a threat of loss or exclusion, or something we love is could be taken away, and that causes us to have some pretty significant emotions that are saying something that we care about is under attack and our bodies are responding appropriately. So to me, it's, where things happen, where we observe what they are, and then our assumptions before we take action is not only the main cause of our responses, but also our biggest opportunity to change them.
That makes sense. So it brings to mind the fight, flight, freeze, or the amygdala kicking in, and sort of that being when we were way back in the day before all of this stuff that we see in the world today existed. We would wake up and we would roll the rock away from the cave door, and we would walk out, and we had to be at, at the height of all of our senses, because if we weren't, we could be eaten by a dinosaur, right? Or like, right? So, but those scripts are imbued in your mind from way back, right? And as humans have evolved, that has remained. But then you get present day and circumstances that are not the end of the world, you're not going to be eaten by a dinosaur, are still responded to or reacted to like you are going to be eaten by a dinosaur. And so, how do we in a modern day world govern or manage or sort of separate this this old world from the new world so that you do show up in a healthy way? Even if cortisol was released, you can. I'll let you unpack that. You're the expert.
Yeah. So, one of the first things that is really helpful is to think about a time where you have been really upset or stressed and
Mhm.
recognize how your body physically responds. Do you get, clenched? Does your heart rate start to go up? Do you sweat? Do you shut down? Do your words escape you? So, how does your body physically respond? Because usually our bodies are ahead of, cognitively what we are aware of. And once you identify those physical signs, you can actually start to recognize when those things are coming up. I really struggle with something called rejection sensitivity, which is a very typical symptom of ADHD, which I
Mhm.
proudly have. And when I started really working through those feelings, I noticed that I would get like a pang in my stomach. Like I would almost get like a feeling in my stomach. And when I started to pay attention to that, I would notice when that would hit, it was always associated with me feeling threatened, that I wasn't worthy. And a lot of that mindset management and critical thinking helped me unpack that so I wouldn't, get super insecure and say, why didn't you text me? Or, you boss is calling you, think you're getting fired. I was able to work through that because I started to pay attention to my physical signs first. So that would be my first recommendation. The next is to separate fact from feeling. Just because you have a feeling doesn't make it a fact. It's
Right.
so simple, but it's like, what?
Mm.
And that really involves another element of, critical thinking, which is perspective. Feelings are valid, but it doesn't make them factual. And so going back and taking a look at what actually happened and responding to the circumstance and not, the outcome or how it made you feel, while it's valid and that still needs protection, you need to work through that. It's not going to, you can't expect handling a situation to ever compensate for how you feel, right? Like fixing a situation is not going to recover hurt feelings. Those are two separate things. So going back to the, my boss is calling, or I called my boss and they're not calling me back, I can make up all the stories in the world that I want to. And there's two really important psychological elements that are at play there. There is confirmation bias, which is my brain actively looking for things to support how I feel, because people like to be right. And I want to be able to support myself in my feelings. So my brain's gonna look for stuff that supports my feelings, because I don't want to tell myself I'm wrong in that situation. Like, I'm trying to be right.
Right.
Uh, and then there's also cognitive bias, things that support how I'm already thinking. So, how am I feeling? How am I thinking? Cognitive confirmation bias are kind of working against us in those types of situations. It also makes us very resistant to other people's opinion. So that's another thing to look for, because again, people don't like to be wrong. Uh, so I might be more apt to look for things that support my internal narrative than
Mhm.
talk myself out of that, because that's the implicit response, is the bias. So now I'm supporting how I feel with what I think are facts. So, oh, well, they don't want to talk to me and they must not have time for me and I must not be important. But when I can acknowledge what's going on, maybe the rampant searching for a solution, or rampant searching for, what I think is a fact, and maybe I'm feeling that pain in my stomach, and maybe I'm starting to get frantic, maybe I can feel my heart starting to increase. That's where I stop and say, what's really going on here? And what's really going on is my boss didn't pick up the phone.
Yeah. Right. 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 It's it's that brings to mind something this is not my novel thought or novel phrase, but believe the best. You believe the best. In those stories that you're telling yourself, to your point, a million different things could be at play. Right? They're on another phone call. They have an emergency in their own family. Something is there. Believe the best. Believe
Yeah.
the best.
Yeah. And you're really getting yourself to a spot where you are, you know, allowing yourself to work on your self esteem. Your self esteem is at the root of emotional wellness, mental wellness, and that comes from all sorts of places. Group membership is one of them. As much as we like to think that we don't care about what other people think, we are social creatures as human beings, and being included versus excluded is so important to our self-esteem, because our group membership, how accepted we are, how many groups we're a part of, whether or not we're welcomed, is how we socially validate who we are. So taking a look around you and, looking at who am I associated with, the product of environment, is really important, especially because information is another important element of critical thinking. Where are you getting your information from? It's
Yeah.
amazing when you talk about quality information. The news, Facebook, Google, they don't owe honesty. The only entity really that owes honesty are like journals. Like the Wall Street Journal is bound by legal constraints that say that you have to report honest and true information.
Yeah.
Everywhere else is opinion. And I even remember I talked to my husband about this, and he was like, well, what about history books? I was like, okay, here's the deal. Like, even in a textbook, you have to think that if I am the person who is writing a textbook, right? And even if it's a recollection of history events, I'm still going to write it in my perspective. Always.
Right.
It's going to
That's right.
be when I was a person observing this particular world event, I'm going to write about the things that stuck out to me based on my history and my worldview. And when you look at it in more of a essence of what happened, I'm kind of a philosophy junkie. So this is going to be really hard for people who don't identify that way. Everything, facts are always relative. And I like to be open to new information. So facts
Mm.
exist to me based on what I already know, but there's constantly information that is surfacing that can change how you feel. I mean, even scientifically, a fact has to be able to be proven false or not false. So that way you can revise your hypothesis, but there's always open for interpretation, which I love, going back to that science perspective, because when we decide that a piece of information we have heard is gospel, it shuts down our opportunity to then be curious about other people, to be curious to learn, to be curious about opportunity. And that's where we can start to freak out and we can have that sky is falling, especially when information is coming from people. Because where do they get their stuff from? They could have heard something crazy on the radio and all of a sudden it's a fact. Like, let's slow down really quick. Who told you this? Okay, but where did that person get their information from? And learning to, this is a very technical phrase, check yourself before you check yourself.
That's very technical.
It is.
I
Yeah.
think I read that in the New England New England Journal of
Yeah.
Medicine, Journal of Medicine.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where I got it too.
I, you, so I've always been curious. So I read the Wall Street Journal every weekday and Saturday. And I typically skim most of the headlines. But what I love to read are the opinion pages. And I know they're opinion pages. So I know by extension, they're not full of facts. They're full of somebody's sort of take on a particular topic. But what I enjoy about the opinion pages in the Wall Street Journal is they allow, let's call it both sides, to author content there. And but what the question I'm getting to, how is one in a world that is geared toward feeding just nonstop information, and a lot of times that information is designed to be clicky, meaning click on this. How does one go about critically thinking through? Let's say we have an article. It's up in front of you. Let's even use the Wall Street Journal. How does one go through an article and differentiate between what is fact, what is opinion, and draw a conclusion from that information?
Yeah, I love this question because it's something that I look through all the time when I'm writing papers or researching a topic. The first thing to look for is the clarity around the topic. Another is whether or not there is an author, whether or not there's a date. But the biggest thing is for me anyway, is when an article is talking about statistics. Because we know that articles always, so many people believe this, etc. Do the links included in the article actually take you to the place in which they obtained those statistics? So are the references accurate and contain the information that the article says that it does? Because that's where I find so many issues with information that I'm reading. And my husband, he'll send me articles all the time. He's like, can you take a look at this? And you'll get these crazy statistics. And I am kind of a science and a data junkie, and I actually love statistics. I'm super weird. But
Uh-huh.
if you look at method of the method of testing, what the sample size was, who the population sample is, um, can the population sample be normally distributed? So, can it be applied to the general public, which requires a certain sample size that is representative of the general population? There are a lot of references to studies and tests that don't meet that basic criteria. So, they'll be like, when you actually look at the study, 5 people in the uppermost part of the boondocks of Washington state said that they identified with this weird thing, and now all of a sudden it's a huge reference in this article. So just because it sounds scholarly does not mean it meets the criteria to be scholarly. Typically, like a .org or a .edu or the Wall Street Journal, where peer-reviewed research is the best research that you can get, or from
Sure.
a journal. I mean, that's quality information. Opinion is great because it allows you to, like you said, see both perspectives and side of the story. Where we want to be careful is, that we're maintaining our own opinion and sources of truth, and we're not falling into confirmation bias, which is looking for information that supports what we believe without identifying whether or not it's real.
That makes sense to me. I mean, in my own world, I think as it relates to that topic, um, I don't wade into political conversations very often, but for my own education, the way I approach it is I look for, uh, let's just use these labels for sake of conversation. I look for sort of right wing, and I want to be careful with that thinking, but I look for that kind of rhetoric or content also from the left side. And then I kind of bring that back into sort of the moderate pieces of this in order to try to get to this thing, which is what I want in my head. So I listen to podcasts from over here. I listen to podcasts from over here. Then I try to listen to content, from this side, all related to politics, so that and I read the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, because many of those are politically written or political articles, to try to form an opinion that it would be Mike's opinion, right? But at least the story I tell myself is that it's I've critically thought through it, because I've kind of gleaned those things that resonate with me most in order to draw an opinion about something, knowing that it's my opinion, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's the key, right? What you just said. When we take our opinion and make it a fact, that is when it's difficult for us to have conversations with other people about their opinion, because
Right.
it transitions from two people discussing opinions, where two people can see different things, both can be right but still disagree. You don't have to change opinions or get someone to agree with you in order to understand. Those are two separate concepts. But when I think my opinion is a fact, and now you're disagreeing with something that I think is a fact, I'm going to argue with you because you're clearly wrong.
Right. That's right.
And how could you be so ridiculous? And that really involves, like, that right there is where critical thinking comes in and like saves the day at its finest. It's like, what's really going on? Is this clear? Is it relevant? And a lot of logic is applied. Like, logic, does this even make sense, what I'm thinking? What do I want the end result to be? And so many arguments and conflict could be saved by two people understanding that we're allowed to have different opinions. We don't need to agree, and we're still great people. We're still great people.
That's right. Would you agree that Stephen Covey wrote a book many years ago, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, and in that one of his seven principles was to seek first to understand and then to be understood. And would you agree that if you approach uh, a circumstance that would require critical thinking, but you do that with the other person in mind first, and you really seek out to genuinely understand where their perspective is, to include all of this stuff, worldview, values, upbringing, et cetera, it allows you, first you bring defenses down, right? I think. And then you can show up, and if you've made the bed right, you can slip in and then be understood with somebody that's willing to listen to you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. So I feel like it's a couple different things, right? It's going
Mhm.
into situations knowing that you are willing to amend or change your opinion based on new facts or information. We only know what we've been exposed to. So in my little worldview bubble in Covington, Washington, in the best place in the Pacific Northwest, and the people I talk to, the things that I listen to, I am not aware of every fact or piece of information that exists on cell phones. So I only know so much. And I have to know and be willing to admit where I am naive, which is another important characteristic of critical thinking, is knowing where your awareness lacks and being
Mm.
open to develop that, and not being so confident that we know everything. So for me to be able to say, even on a topic that I've spent a lot of time researching, I mean, I might know more than most about critical thinking, but I'm not going to let somebody not add to what I already know. That's a gift.
Sure.
That's a gift. And I'm really, if I decide that what I know is fact and don't let anyone add to what I already know, I am stopping myself from growing.
That's
So
right.
when we are resistant or hesitant to learn from others, we are literally stopping our growth right there because we're not open to new ideas or opinion. So that's a piece of it, is going into situations willing to learn and willing to change how you think, or being open for new opportunity to learn, or to advance something that you already know. I feel like that is a really big theme that I am seeing, not just in our industry, but in general. I feel like people are doing a lot more talking about how they feel, but
Mm.
there's a listening problem. I'm just going to say it. We have a listening problem. And I don't know if it's because we are, and seeing people in person again, and now we've got all these opinions and we want to share them. But in order for me to really like execute and exercise critical thinking, I need to go in and be a discoverer of information and be less concerned with what I know. I spent a lot of time learning how to ask thoughtful questions over the last year. And to me, in order to be a good leader, I should not have to tell other people what I know. The fact that I know how to ask questions makes me look smart, like, how did she know how to ask that? Or that was such a great question. My job now is to really help other people understand what it is that they know, which also helps me learn more about what I already know. So I'm more in like this confirmation, validation, changing, so then I can help spread that to the world or whoever I'm talking to next. But if we don't go in and seek to understand, like you said, we are not learning and we are not growing. So to me, it's less of a courtesy and more of an opportunity to learn from others and then to add to what they or we or us already know.
Yeah, I love the way you unpack that, and I think that your quest to discover and learn how to practice the art of thoughtful questions really is, in terms of leadership, you doing that and you asking those thoughtful questions is giving cause for, is actually a catalyst for others to think critically, because you're not thinking for them, but you're rather sort of planting those seeds of the opportunity to do that critical thinking and to come to a conclusion that may not, it's not like you're guiding them to a conclusion. What you care about is between here and conclusion, it's how does your mind process, right? That's what we're really after, is how does your mind critically think until you get to a conclusion? That
Absolutely. Which is, gosh, I mean, it's relevant in any industry, but, ours especially. I'm never really concerned about the end result, but like you said, what
Mhm.
what happens there. And when I am writing or when I'm speaking or even in my own world, I mean, if we don't understand why or the thinking behind how something happened, we will always only put band-aids on bullet wounds. We have to go back and change the thinking and change the process and the understanding in order to change habits and change behaviors and change attitudes, because that's where thoughts come from. So when we learn information, it cognitively, it goes in, it forms a thought, which forms a belief. Our beliefs have attitudes, and our attitudes influence our action. So if we want to change that cycle, we have to apply critical thinking and understand thoughts first. Why do I think what I think? And we have to be humble enough to know that we might be thinking the wrong thing, that maybe we've been a little negative, or maybe a little bit more awareness, or maybe I've been going too fast. And gauging other people's reactions and responses to us is a great place to start, but it does take a certain amount of awareness and humility in order to do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Those are two predicates that, look, we all get emotionally loaded from time to time, and to the extent that you can understand why, that self-awareness, why you get emotionally loaded, why you get triggered, all these things, why you show up to certain conversations the way you do, that goes a long way in helping you sort of navigate your way through it. So that being said, I'm interested, if you, in all of your research, have you found, I mean, we could go two ways with this, right? There's let's describe it as big T trauma and little T trauma. And so there are heavyweight tools that can get you through big T trauma, but I have to believe there are sort of light level tools that can get you through small T trauma. And small T trauma can be like, oh my gosh, I slept through the alarm and now I'm late for work and my boss is going to be angry at me. So that's just context for small T trauma. Are there light level tools that somebody that works on site or somebody who works in the corporate office at a multifamily property could exercise? I'm emotionally loaded. I need a tool to help me get back here so I can actually have a conversation in a healthy way. Are
Yeah,
you aware of tools like that?
yeah, absolutely. So, before going into little things, I think it's important to talk about how day to day management of wellness really even allows you to have access to those little tools. Like for
Mm-hmm.
me, I exercise every day. If not, I'm really mean and rude. And I also kind of shake stuff off. And I also eat really well. Proper nutrition for me is one of the number one things that I do for myself on a regular basis. It is insane the amount of direction that nutrition gives your blood cells, and your and your chemicals in your brain. Like it literally tells your body what to do. Your nutrition does. So when that's not on point, you can't expect to have access to other stress management techniques or all of the possible things that your body can do. And when we are under so much stress, people might, resonate with this process, but our genes and our bodies carry specific genetics, and we might always be like dormant carriers of specific even mental health issues, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
under the right environment and circumstance, our body is under enough stress where that gene actually becomes expressed because it's our way of handling things. So if we don't take care of ourselves first, we could be at risk for maladaptive genetic expression, which then it doesn't allow us to manage these little things on a day-to-day basis. So it's all a part of the stress cycle, and stress in multifamily and any workplace is like the number one killer of mental wellness. So
Mhm.
if we've got that stuff checked, right? Little things that we can do when maybe we feel triggered, we're starting to pay attention to those physical signs. The first thing that we can do is take a breath. Slow breathing or even intentional breathing, where you hold your breath at the top for a couple seconds and let it out, is a very quick way to reset your nervous system. And your
Mhm.
nervous system is the one that comes in and says, hey, let's fight or let's flight. And
Right.
can cause triggers, which the minute we get emotionally flooded, which is kind of that response, then our brains are going to go back to that ladder of inference in our worldview and say, when this happens, here's how I respond, and here's what we're going to do, because we need to figure out a way to bring ourselves back down. But we're not necessarily sure how to do that yet. So it ends up a giant mess.
Right.
So breathing is a good one. Another thing that we can do is take stress off of ourselves by resetting expectations. For example, we don't have to have all the answers. It's okay not to know. It's okay to say, you know what, that's a great question. Let me find that out and follow up. As leaders, sometimes we feel really pressured to know the answers, and it's
Mhm.
okay to be vulnerable and say, team, I'm not really sure what to do, but I know that we need to collaborate, and I know that we need to work together to find a solution, and let's figure out what the problem is. Another big one that sounds so simple, but it's huge, is being able to ask for help, being able to
Oh.
raise your hand and say, I need support, or asking for what you need to be okay. This is again, one of those things that sounds so simple, but we think that when we raise our hand, it's a sign of weakness. I don't
Mhm.
know. I'm not good enough. They're going to think this. This is another element where critical thinking is so important, because we are going to not put ourselves in a position to get what we need because of stories we're telling ourselves about how other people are going to think of us. And it's a spider story. It's completely made up. And you would be surprised at how many people are like, yeah, no problem. When I am in meetings that are all day, I know that I have a hard time sitting still. It's a
Mm.
ADHD thing. So I will go to whoever's facilitating that meeting and say, hey, just so you know, I might need to stand up a couple times. Like, don't worry about me. Or if I'm on long meetings, I will let people know, like, hey, I might shut my camera off a couple times. Don't worry. I'm just kind of stretching and moving around so I can stay engaged. And I am allowed to ask for what I need without shame, without guilt, because I deserve that. But we're still kind of getting over that stigma. And it could because we've got values of being, knowledgeable and knowing all the answers and being worthy, but nothing about raising a hand. Like, that's a sign of courage. That is actually an element of critical thinking, is knowing your own knowledge limits and not being afraid to admit where those stop and where they begin. So asking for help is another one. Using your resources, slowing down, maybe planning is another one. I'm a huge planner. Sometimes we think that we have all this stuff to do, and the thought of it is really overwhelming. But when we write down what it is that we need to get done and then be thoughtful about how to go in and attack that, it is one of the best things that we can do, because it takes this big idea of overwhelm into something you can actually manage. Think about, what is step one? Not how do I get to the end? What's
Right.
the first thing that I need
Right.
to do? Even if that first thing is take a breath, or take a walk, or go get a drink of water, or say, I just need a minute. Let me just process. There's nothing wrong with any of those tools.
No, I think you're so right, and I think for so long, society has taught you one thing, which is quite the opposite of what you should practice in your life and being a holistic human. And I do think I 100% agree with you in terms of um, the label I like to give it is priming the pump. And so morning routines, or I often refer to them as rituals, certainly exercise, certainly nutrition. I think sleep is another thing. If you neglect those areas of your life, you've already reduced the probability of you showing up in the world and being able to handle an emotional hijack, right? You've already set the stage for you to fail if you don't take care of those things. It I the level of importance as it relates to those things is just off the chart. We could do a whole segment on that at some point, that how important that is to your showing up. I As you were speaking through that, it brought to mind a quote that you have in the presentation about preparation. I know you called it planning, but it brought preparation to mind. And the quote is something to the effect of, if I had, and I'm going to butcher this, so please correct me. If I had an hour to do something, I would spend the first 55 minutes preparing. Now correct me and tell me how that, and sort of talk about that.
Yes, I believe it's an Einstein quote, and it's if I had 100 minutes to solve a problem, I would spend 99 of them figuring out what the problem is.
That's
Uh,
it.
Another great element of critical thinking, because we've all solved the wrong problem, and we know it because the problem keeps coming back. Like,
That's so
I
right.
thought I figured this out, and I'm sure, like, our service team members identify with this the most. But there is a certain amount of troubleshooting that you do with critical thinking. You're trying to land on the right thing, but so many times we just jump to a conclusion of what the problem is. We solve it without thinking, and then it keeps coming back. Or, this is one of my personal pet peeves: we solve problems that have to do with other people without inviting the people in which it affects the conversation.
Right.
Like, we'll roll out initiatives that impact the service team or the office team members, but nobody included them as a stakeholder, and now somehow it would actually work for them. Oh
Right.
yeah, great idea, do it. And they're like, what were they? What? Who in their right mind? That's part of obtaining data, is inviting the right stakeholders to the conversation. And
That's right.
that just drives me crazy, is figuring out what is the real problem, who are the right people involved, and doing a lot of discovery and a lot of question asking so you can really land on the right problem, because solutions don't matter if the problem's not identified.
No, I think you're so right. And if you bring that back to sort of a practical application, in this could apply to any business, but in multifamily, it's I'm trying to pull from my personal archives, but let's say a regional manager calls me on the phone and is stimulated emotionally, describing a situation to me, and they get me wrapped into their emotion, and all of a sudden I'm problem solving and I'm telling them what to do without and they go and do that thing, and then I come to find out that, to your point, we weren't even working on the right problem. We were playing football when we should have been playing baseball, right? And so, to your point, it's super
Yeah,
important. Yeah,
you
you
were
got to put.
feeling solving, not fact solving.
Yes, that's a great punchline to that. That's exactly what you're doing. So it's important to put pure definition to your issue, and then, to your point, get all the right stakeholders or participants into the room to have a real conversation so you can really round that thing out before you go about baking out solutions.
Yeah. And that's such a good example of how I think we can help those around us, like, really employ critical thinking. If somebody calls us and they are really frantic or upset, and it's just, walking them through, like, well, how do you know? Just a simple question. How do
Yeah.
you know? well, they didn't send it and I've had performance issues. Okay, well, did you call and verify? Or show me a report. Where's the data? It's all like that's a whole other pet peeve of mine is a lack of data driven decisions. And this is a great spot to start is before you make a decision, have something concrete that backs it up. Not an opinion, not an assumption, not a conclusion, but where's the data that you can then evaluate and put your opinions together and see if we can identify what the problem is. So it's, instead of show me the money, it's show me the data. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is so right. It's most, if not all, things can be traced back to some sort of origin story, right, or a genesis, so you can actually do a takeoff from there to get to a real conclusion. And we're all get. Look, I'm still I hold a fair level of responsibility in our organization, and I'm still guilty of someone calling me on the phone. And look, it's innate in me to want to solve a problem, and that's partly being a male, and males just want to solve all the problems in the world with a hammer and some duct tape. But we everyone's guilty of that, right? And I think to the extent you can employ that, okay, let's take a deep breath. Let's get you regulated a little bit first, and then let's get the definition of what we're talking about before we take off. It's so important because you end up, I think, embedded in all of this is you waste a tremendous amount of mental and emotional energy going about. Look, the world's already hard. Our work is already hard. We just make it even harder when we don't take time.
Yes. Yeah, which is so unnatural in multifamily to take time with things, but it probably, and I don't have, data on this going against my own stuff, but it probably takes the same amount of time to solve the problem the right way as it does to fix it wrong a ton of times. So it's like pick your poison. Do you want to, just make that shotgun decision and then keep fixing the problem? Or do we slow down and start practicing planning and talking about it? And there's so many just wonderful things that we don't, have time to go into about involving people in conversations and the investment that creates from, team and buy-in and being included in conversations, where you can really drive, positive organizational performance by asking questions and slowing down and involving other people in the plan. But it's also a best practice in critical thinking.
It truly is. It's hard because people want to help people, right? And you don't want to dismiss emotion as something that you could label as drama. You don't want to do that either because you could hurt someone, and you could give cause for them to avoid ever bringing a problem back to you because you don't handle that emotion right as a leader, right? So you have to acknowledge it, understand it, love the person where they're at, help them self-regulate a little bit, and then get to a healthy conclusion. We're coming up on an hour here. I want to make sure that we end cap in a way that our audience, our listeners, can take something away from this conversation. I feel like they're going to take a ton away from this conversation, but to end cap it, what do you think audience members can take away and employ, say, in the next conversation that requires critical thinking? What can we end cap with here that would be meaningful?
Yeah, probably one of my favorite things to say is that, and I said it earlier, but there's power in what you give power to, and you get to decide what you give power to and what you take power away from, uh, and figuring out what it is that you want to do every day to set yourself up for stressful situations to be able to manage those appropriately. I'm a big fan of, instead of a to-do list, a to-don't list, and
I love
figuring
that.
out what am I not going to do today? What am I not going to let in? Those boundaries. But I think the next conversation that someone's in, knowing there's power, what I give power to, that will help manage triggers,
Mm.
and practice asking a question before you respond. Make it a habit. Ask at least 1 to 3 questions before you respond, even if it's confirming what you heard. That is a great way to start practicing discovering the right information. So figure out what that question is, depending on the conversation, but get in the habit of asking questions before you give your opinion.
I That is a beautiful ending. Yeah, because our default is, oh, well, here's what you should do instead of asking questions. I love
Mhm.
that. Yeah, default is what's going on here, really.
Yeah,
So, okay, well, Jessica, it's always I think this is the second time we've had a conversation of some length, and I just apply. I want to acknowledge you as an individual working in the business world and in the multifamily space specifically, in the work that you are doing, because I think it is critical and crucial, especially in the world that we live in today, and the practical applications of the things that you are working on. And I have to believe in my heart of hearts, the tools that will be born out of the work that you are doing that we can employ as professionals is going to be super meaningful. And we'd love to support you in that, ongoing and always. It's beautiful what you're doing. I appreciate it.
thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Absolutely. Well, I do want to have a round two at some point because you have a whole other presentation deck. Yes, I printed it. Sorry. that I'd love to dig through with you because I think it's equally meaningful, and it's this critical thinking conversation is sort of a segue to that, and we'll come back and do a round two at some point if you're interested.
Totally. Can't wait.
All right, awesome. I really appreciate your time today, making an investment with us. And for the rest of you, we'll see you next time on Collective Conversations.